at the end of the day, everyone wants to be able to do all these things, but once they actually get to the point where they are doing all those things, they alienate a lot of people. And I've alienated a lot of people in my life. Some that I'm like, okay, you know, good riddance because that's life. But some I actually really regret, because I think there have been situations where I've prioritized my personal time management, my goals, even relationships, my relationships, to the point where I haven't seen where the other person is coming from. It goes back to the intention thing we were talking about, where I was so clear on my intention that I didn't see what their intention was. And so I think, like, the time management stuff is so valuable and has gotten me so far in life and will continue to do so. But it comes with a grain of salt of, like, it might put a strain on relationships, and everyone's going to have a sort of different tolerance for how much that they're willing to put a strain against, right? I think I have a pretty high tolerance, which I don't know if I'm proud of or not, but because it's just such a big, important part of my life. But, you know, everyone sort of needs to figure out that tolerance for themselves and where they are, and what they're willing to sort of let go if they choose to live this kind of life, essentially.
Welcome to the Improving Humans podcast, where improving humans share their stories, experiences, and lessons to help other humans improve. Today I'm joined by Karishma Motwani. She is the Director of Technical Product Management at a fintech startup in New York City, but her interests and impact don't just stop there. In fact, because we're talking about time management and prioritization today, I wanted to give the people an idea of why I'm talking to you. So I took the liberty of writing down a day in the life, and I couldn't fit it on one piece of paper, so I thought I would write out everything that you do in a day. So here's Karishma's day. 8 a.m. leg day, 9:15 a.m. sauna and meditation, 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. working at a startup, 7 p.m. video shoot, 7:45 p.m. FaceTiming your parents for the volley, 8 to 10 p.m. dance class. And what's even more remarkable about this is I picked a day at random. And what this also doesn't include is things like meal prepping and eating, social media management, because that's a huge part of, you know, your brand and your ability to basically run your business on the side, communication with people that you love, your friends, family, etc., random things that tend to pop up and could be adversity throughout the course of your schedule, and I imagine sleeping at some point. So I think you're the perfect person to talk to about this, and I've personally been someone who's struggled with time management and prioritization, been trying to get better at it, so being able to talk to you from both your professional standpoint but also how you navigate your life personally is super exciting. So thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you. That was crazy.
Before you can have a list of things that you can do, you need to have, I imagine, a desire to do things, right? So I kind of wanted to ask you about your drive. Is that something that started early on in life, or is that something that you developed later? Like, how did you have the drive to want to do things?
Yeah, it's funny because, like, I think back to when I was like 16, 17 years old, and I was living this crazy of a life even as a teenager. So I do think it was sort of instilled in me early in life. I think my parents had a lot to do with it. My parents, for context, run a brick and mortar business. And that business exists within a mall. And so they're really tied to, even though it is their own business, they're tied to the hours that the mall is open. And so they work 7 days a week, 12 hours most days. And during the holiday season, the mall is open for longer hours, so even longer. And my parents are in their 60s and 70s. So, and they're still doing that today. So I think I use that example because I think it really speaks to where I get it from. I was just sort of raised by people who lived like this, and that was the only way I knew how to live, essentially. And I've had it ever since.
That's amazing. So, like, how does that translate then to maybe like early school life? Because your parents obviously are professionals in that sense and dedicating that many hours. Like, did you still translate that to school, or was it still like you were still figuring yourself out in terms of your work schedule with school?
Yeah, I think I did translate it to school. So when I was really, really young, I remember, you know, I would obviously wake up and go to school at the crack of dawn, as kids do, which I still will never understand. And I would get back, and like sort of the schedule that my mom put together for me was you get back and you like have a snack or whatever, and you immediately go do your homework. There is no break in between, right? Tough. You immediately go do your homework, and then whatever, it's dinner time, and you only really have a chance to play or like go take a dance class when I was younger or do that extracurricular after all those things are achieved and accomplished. And that was sort of the rule. Part of it, I think that the reason the rule was set that way is because they were so busy.
Yeah.
So they needed to like sort of instill that routine in me in order to make their lives work around it.
Yeah.
I also had a lot of babysitters, and it was much easier to tell the babysitter, hey, like feed her and make her go do her homework.
Right.
You know,
Like she has to go immediately to do work. It's not like
yeah, exactly.
She has
and it
downtime.
was just a routine that they got me used to. And then as I got older, obviously in high school and stuff, I started, you know, playing more sports and dancing a lot more and sort of having a little bit more free will around what I wanted to do. But even then it was sort of, you know, grades can't slip, obviously,
Yeah.
and more importantly, the day-to-day routine cannot slip still.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So you eventually go to, I'm going to fast forward a bit to, you go to Rutgers. So you end up majoring in communications and finance, if I'm not mistaken. You also go to the business school as well. So during that time in school, I mean, for a lot of us, myself personally, it's kind of the first time that you're away from your parents. You don't have that structure of what's built in the household. So you kind of have to figure out your own routine. I know I went a little crazy in terms of staying up late at night and like not having that much of a routine. And I had to focus that when I started, you know, studies got more serious. So did you immediately translate into college? Like, it worked out fine because your schedule was intact, or was it a transition period? How was that?
So I had a really interesting college experience. I grew up in New Jersey, went to college 20 minutes away, and the first 2 years of school, I commuted to school.
Oh, okay.
So I still lived with my parents. So that, you know, made me still have somewhat of a routine. I needed to sort of come back to my parents' home for the first couple of years.
Yeah.
Even then, though, I did do a lot at school. So my sophomore year, I was taking a full, you know, semester of classes. And I had a full-time co-op, so a 9-to-5 job as well. And I didn't want to turn it down because sophomores rarely got those opportunities. So I said, you know, I'm going to take it. Yeah. But sophomores weren't allowed to claim credit for those opportunities. Only juniors and seniors were.
Oh,
so I still had to be in school full-time and be working full-time at the same time. And on top of that, I was like, I'm not going to give up dance. So I danced on, like, you know, really late at night and on weekends. So I think to answer your question, you know, because I grew up like that, that's just sort of what I've been drawn to my whole life. I will say, I think back to my sophomore year of college and I'm like, why did I? Like, there was really no reason to do that. You know what I mean? And you know, if we get into this, we can. But I actually think, you know, my time management, I'm very proud of myself for how I approach things, but there are times in my life where I look back and I think there was really no need to do that, and I got to learn to let go a little bit sometimes. But that said, yes, to answer your question, absolutely. It was just how I've always lived.
Are there any books you picked up at that time? It doesn't have to be from the school itself, but maybe that you just like found that was like, oh, this is actually helpful for like time management, et cetera, or was that professionally later that happened?
So the premise of the book is essentially, it's called Atomic Habits because you're supposed to form habits at like the most granular level.
Oh.
And then you stack on top of that, right? So for example, if my goal is to, you know, lose weight and gain muscle at the gym, I'm not going to just go, you know, lift the heaviest weights and go work out for 7 hours a day, right? How do you start really, really small, you know, do the at-home workout first if you've never worked out before, and then stack on top of that some nutrition only after it's become a habit, and then slowly build your way up. And the idea is they become habits and lifestyle actual changes only when you approach it that way in a slow and controlled environment.
Interesting.
Otherwise, it's just a phase. Yeah, so in college, the parts of college that I liked best were the parts where I was working, not where I was studying and living a quote-unquote college student lifestyle. Right. I was one of those people that couldn't wait to get out of school.
Yeah.
And, you know, everyone told me you're going to get out of school and you're going to regret it. You're going to really miss school and college and all of that. And at the time, I was like, no, I'm really not going to miss it because I know this is what I was meant for.
Yeah.
And I honestly still don't miss it. I really think that I was meant for like a more professional, you know, manage my own time, figure out what I want to work on and stick with it type of life. So yes, the transition from college to career was relatively easy. I think the hard part was now, you know, when I'm prioritizing other things like dance and whatever else, the downside is not just a lower grade if something falls through the cracks, right? It's my whole career. It's my income. It's, you know, how I make money, and if I lose my job or, you know, if I don't get that promotion or whatever it might be, what's the next step? So there was a little bit more fear around that. I think within a couple years, though, I realized I'm like pretty good at the corporate thing.
Right.
So I didn't have as much to worry about as I thought I would.
Interesting. So as you sort of get maybe more confident or more comfortable with sort of your corporate career, you realize I actually can manage those things without it impacting my actual career.
Exactly. And between me graduating college and about a year and a half into my corporate career, I actually stopped dancing. It was not intentional. I think, at the time I was no longer dancing with the dance company that I was on. I had not found my next thing yet. And so I sort of just stopped by nature of where I was in life.
Right.
And it was really a year and a half into my professional career that I looked back up and I was like, wait, I really love doing this thing and I think I can handle it. Let me go back to it.
Yeah.
But in a weird way, again, retrospectively looking back, I think that was really helpful so that I could focus on that big life change first.
And then be able to add components onto it afterwards and sort of figure out that balance.
Exactly. Atomic habits.
Atomic habits. See, I'm learning. I was looking through, funny enough, your LinkedIn, and I was looking through some of like the skill sets that you've taken on. And there's one thing that stuck out to me because I'd heard it in my previous job but never really used it all that much. It's something called agile methodologies.
Yeah.
So I'm going to do a summary of what I've understood. Feel free to correct me if any of it's wrong. But just the general idea or the component that interested me was like the feedback part of it. So like as you go through a process of figuring something out or working on a project, like you're getting feedback in real time and then iterating on how it works. So the reason I bring that up is I wanted to ask you about how that might translate to how you put your schedule together. So like I imagine, like you said before, you're focusing on your corporate career, you put dance to the side like unintentionally, and then you start to add it back on. What's that process of putting a schedule together? Like how much iterations do you do? Do you solidify it at a certain point and just say, all right, this is enough, or is it in constant flux? Like how does the scheduling part work?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So the way I found works for me is everything's in my calendar. Like literally commute times are in my calendar, right?
Wow.
Everything is in my calendar because I need to be able to, throughout the course of a day or a week, pull up a physical thing and say, this is what I have to get done. And this is how I've planned sort of the timing around it. So that's what works for me. I think the nice thing about doing that as well is when things change, I can sort of just on my phone drag and drop. And so it's not this big process of, oh my God, how am I going to do something else now because something came up, or I'm stuck in traffic, or this class got canceled, or whatever it might be. I don't need to think that hard about rescheduling things because tangibly it's literally just a drag and drop. So it sounds small, but I think stuff like that is super important for me because I want to like remove the barriers to being able to adjust on the fly, right? So that's really helpful. And then to your point about like that feedback loop, I'm changing it constantly.
Okay.
I, may have a plan to wake up at 7 a.m. and work out, and the night before I can't fall asleep, and while I'm laying in bed unable to fall asleep, look at my calendar and switch things around for the day,
Wow.
right? I think that, that won't work for everyone, but to me that's super important because I work in a career, sort of quote unquote 9 to 5, where it's not a 9 to 5. It can be a 10 to 3 one day, and it can be a 7 to 7 one day.
Yeah.
Especially being at a startup. So I need to be able to create that level of flexibility for myself and constantly be iterating and changing in order to prioritize what matters, which to me is work and my health and dance. And so to fit it all in, I need to be constantly changing it. And in fact, sometimes retroactively, like the next day or the next week, I'll go and look back at what happened and see like, did I actually do the things when I said I was going to do them? Not in a way to sort of judge myself or grade myself or anything, but in a way to learn from it and say, okay, clearly I planned to work out 7 a.m. 4 days this week. That's just not feasible based on how I live my life.
Yeah.
So let me adjust for the coming week, right? And I'll even go back to the previous weeks and say, okay, the workout said 7 to 8:30, but then drag it down and say, no, it actually happened at this time, so I'm going to change it on my schedule retroactively. So I can go back, and there's always sort of like this source of truth around what was supposed to happen and then what actually happened. And that I think has allowed me to slowly but surely get better at figuring out what I want my own day to look like.
That makes sense. And I'm curious about this calendar. So is everything, how granular do you get in terms of the organization of it? Like, is it colored even by like something's a personal thing, something's a professional thing, so that way you have like a mental note of like you don't even get confused by just the blocks and stuff? Like how granular do you get in case anybody's watching and like, hey, I want to put my own calendar together? Like what does yours comprise of?
Yeah, so it is color coded, but that's because I use different accounts for different things and then I share them with each other.
I see.
So I use like Google Calendar, and luckily work also uses Google Calendar, so that's helpful.
Yeah.
And I've shared my personal calendar to my work email, and I've also shared my dance calendar, which I have a separate account for, to my work email. And so when I log in at work for the day, and I can log in on my phone as well, I see like everything in blue is my work calendar, everything in red is my personal calendar, and then I have like a yellowish for my dance stuff, and I can see how they overlap. And for me, someone who lives like a busy life like I do, it's also really helpful to be able to take that whole thing and share it with people in my life.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So my boyfriend, Anshul, has my calendar shared with him because otherwise he would literally have no idea where I am or what I'm doing. And so that's also the helpful part of it, right? Because one of the downsides of living a life this way and time managing to this granularity is like most people in the world don't do it this way.
Yeah.
And so how do you like let people into your life and still be able to have like a social life and be able to communicate with other people? This is sort of my way, right? I can share this stuff and you know sort of exactly where I am and what I'm doing. And that way at the end of the night, Anshul's like, so how was and then he'll pull up my calendar and he'll be like, oh yeah, how was that one meeting with that one person you had? And it's really specific. It's also teaching people to be like better communicators.
That is so great, because the normal convention is just like, hey, like, honey, how was your day?
Yeah.
But now he can literally ask you specifically about your day with
Yeah.
actual intention and like detail, which is
Yeah.
kind of cool, actually. I've never heard that before.
Yeah, it's very helpful.
So I also want to ask you about the mental piece of having a calendar, because what you said is like, I think a lot of us, and I've definitely been like a person who does this, where you have this idea the day before, maybe like, hey, I'm going to do this at this specific time, but it's only mentally logged in. So like if anything disrupts that, it almost throws off my entire mental, just like, wow, like I had this thing, even though no one knows I had this thing, like I had this thing in my head and now it's ruined my day.
Yeah.
For when you move around those blocks on your calendar, is there a mental component where it makes just life easy in terms of like expectation setting and managing all that? Like how has that maybe helped in that capacity?
Absolutely. I think the reason it's important for me to be able to quickly drag and drop and move things around is because then it's on paper somewhere and I can remove it from my brain, right? I don't need to be constantly thinking about it. And I know that there's always going to be this thing that has the source of truth on it. I don't need to know what it is anymore, right? I can do it and then forget it and then go focus on what I need to focus on and then come back later. It doesn't need to take up brain space. So that's really, really helpful mentally. The other thing I've realized mentally for me that's helpful is, to some degree, you know, day to day, actually things I need to get done, I need to, you know, manage on a day to day level.
Sure.
But when it comes to like goals and habits and things like that I want to create, the reality is, based on the life I live, there's going to be weeks that I'm dancing every day. There's going to be weeks that I'm not dancing at all, or I'm traveling for work, or I'm doing something or the other. So even when I'm saying, you know, I want to work out X number of times, I don't track it on a daily basis or even a weekly basis. I track it on a monthly basis.
Oh, interesting.
So I say, okay, in the month of September or whatever it might be, I want to work out 20 times. There's 1 week where I'm traveling for work or for personal life or whatever.
Yeah.
And I know that that week it's going to happen maybe once. And I'm not going to beat myself up for that because that's life. And so I've sort of learned to find the right granularity at which I want to track my life. The day-to-day meetings and scheduling stuff needs to happen on a daily basis, an hourly basis on my calendar.
Yeah.
The goals and stuff, you know, need to happen on like a monthly basis because there's going to be weeks where I just can't do it.
Yeah.
And then there's other things, you know, like more project managey type things at work that I want to track on a weekly basis. So just figuring out what that personal like granularity, I think, is, and it looks different for me than it will for you or whatever else. I think is super important, because then you don't really beat yourself up mentally when you don't make it to the gym that one day or whatever it might be, because you know, okay, I'm not tracking on a daily basis. It doesn't actually matter.
Right. That makes sense. And for someone who, let's say they may not even know that Google Calendar can do those things, or they're at the lowest level of, hey, Karishma, like I'm not even remotely an organized person, haven't been, but I'm curious about starting to at least try to be somewhat organized. Is there like base level things, not maybe like the comprehensiveness of putting all these calendars together, but something small you think maybe someone could start with if they want to try and get organized?
Yeah, in college, I used to do the trick where I used pen and paper, and I just wrote down what are the top 3 things I want to do today. And if nothing else happens, if I get those 3 things done, I'm making progress, right? So it can literally be like in your notes app on your phone while you're on the train, or it can be on a piece of paper if that's helpful for you, right? It doesn't need to be that serious. It again, like going back to Atomic Habits, I actually didn't think I would retain so much from this book. I guess I have. It doesn't need to be, you know, this grandiose thing day one. It will only become grandiose and sustainably grandiose if you start at a smaller level.
Let me know if this jogs any memories.
Oh my God, you dug deep.
So I love doing research, clearly. And I found your Twitter account.
Oh no.
And this is one of a couple, we'll talk off camera about some pretty incredible tweets. At some point you say you love like Mott's like apple juice or something. Like it was, you were living your life on that. It was great. But this one was funny because I read it and I was like, wow, like I feel this way all the time. You said it's like, why did I choose to be an idiot? Why didn't I sleep earlier last night? Like you were basically lamenting about the fact that like, wow, like I was up so late. And I'm someone, even though like I work like a corporate life now, I still sometimes stay up late. I'm used to waking up early now because I just have a job, but I deal with my day now. I'm like tired, lethargic, etc. And you mentioned before you do have a night where like maybe you're up a night, etc. I would love to just unpack the role that sleep plays in your life. Like, how did maybe you start off with your sleep schedule? Like, has it evolved over time? Let's just start like there.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier in our conversation that my sophomore year I was working a full-time job and full-time school and all of that.
Yeah.
That year I can't remember a single night where I felt rested. I can't remember waking up a single day where I was like, I feel good. And as a result of that lack of sleep, and I knew, you know, work and grades were a priority, everything else fell through. My friendships fell through.
Yeah.
My, you know, my like physical health fell through. I gained a ton of weight that year, was not thinking about nutrition. And I think if I had done slightly less and slept slightly more, those other things could have been maintained a little bit better. So I think I've learned a lot since then. And it's a constant battle, frankly, because there's so much I want to do and there's so much I want to accomplish, and there always, no matter what I'm doing, every day I feel like there's not enough hours in the day to get it all done.
Yeah.
I will never feel like there's enough hours in the day.
Right.
But now I've learned that if I don't sleep, I can't maintain like the physical goals that I want to have in my body, right? Like going to the gym, lifting weights, whatever. I can't be a really good dancer sustainably for a long time if I don't sleep. And so I think that reality really hit me at some point, and I think it's hit me in smaller ways throughout the years, but more specifically about 2.5 years ago, I was going through, honestly, a really rough patch in my life, and I had moved back home with my parents. And sort of, you know, one thing after the other was just a mess in my life, and things had just ended. And it felt like just as things had ended and like, you know, maybe things would start looking up, I got really sick to the point where I think I went to 7 or 8 different doctors and no one could quite pinpoint why I was feeling the way I was feeling. I broke out in like allergies that I had never had before. I had allergic eczema. I didn't even know that was a thing.
Shit.
Who knows? And my parents were freaking out. And all I could do during that time, it was like a 3-week period where I just like couldn't figure out what was wrong with my body. All I could do during that time was sleep because there was nothing else that I had the energy to do.
Right.
And, you know, this is not scientific, but I genuinely believe that that time in my life was my body and my mind telling me, like, sit down. Like, you've done so much and shit has hit the fan in your life and you just need to sit down for a second here.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So since then, on a positive note, since then, I mentioned I track my goals on a monthly basis. So the things I track are how often I meditate, because meditation is very important in my life, how often I work out on a monthly basis, how often I track my nutrition to keep, you know, my body healthy, and how many nights a month I get 8 hours of sleep. And so now it's an explicit goal that at least half of the month, 15 days out of the month, I need to get 8 hours of sleep. And if I find myself approaching the end of the month and not being close to that goal of 15 nights, right, of sleep, of proper sleep, I sort of reflect back and I'm like, how do I actually feel right now? And 9 times out of 10, I feel like crap.
Yeah.
And so then for the remaining week or whatever's left in that month, I will deprioritize other things because chances are I lost sleep because I prioritized the other stuff too much, right? I will deprioritize those things and I will prioritize the sleep so I can hit that goal. And so it's not perfect, but I'm a very like achievement goal oriented person.
Right.
It needs to like have some sort of sense of accomplishment for me to even want to do it. And so sleep has to become one of those things in order for me to want to do it. I have to feel like I achieved it.
It is so interesting you say that, because I mean a common just term or phrase used in just like our lives in general is like you can sleep when you're dead. Like you'll get to it when you get to it. But I think like the fact that by the way, I so appreciate you sharing that story, because I think it helps, because I'm sure there's a lot of times your body tells you or your mind tells you like you need to take a break and not. And some people don't have that experience yet, which is why they keep pushing sleep to the side. Those moments where you do have like a night where, let's say, you know, you are getting your hours and then one night you just can't fall asleep or whatever for some reason. How do you sort of bounce back from that? Is that just a day where you're like, okay, now I have to assess what I'm doing in that day, or do you still try to power through? Like, how do you navigate maybe those things happening?
Yeah, I think it depends on the day, right? There's going to be days where I'm like, I can't control that my entire C-suite at work is coming into the office. I gotta go do it. You know, I can't sleep for the extra hour in the morning. But then there's other days where I have a little bit more control over my time. So it really does depend on the day. I think assuming I do have the flexibility, I will reschedule the morning workout. Because even if I push myself to get up and go work out, I'm not going to feel as good at the gym. Yeah. Everything from there is just down.
Dominoes, yeah.
Right? And yeah, so assuming I have the flexibility, I will reschedule the thing and I will try not to beat myself up about it. Again, being able to quickly drag and drop on a calendar, or being able to track goals monthly instead of daily, all of that is helpful for me mentally to not beat myself up about it.
Yeah.
On days where I don't have the flexibility and I sort of just have to power through, I will, because it sometimes, it's not that there's no other choice, but the right choice is to power through depending on what's happening in my life. And I will reschedule the next day, right? Or I will reschedule the coming days or weeks after that in order to say, okay, I know this week I'm not going to get a lot of sleep. That means next week, here is how I'm going to prioritize my life differently. Actually, recently, my company that I work at is fully remote. And so the entire product and engineering team got together in New York. And the people at my company love to go out. So I knew going into it that it would be work really hard during the day with everyone.
Yeah.
And party really hard at night, every night on a Tuesday night,
even. Oh my God.
With everyone. And so I knew that going in. And so I knew that week my sleep goals were not going to be met. So I planned ahead of time, right? Like, how am I going to make up for this, basically, and make sure that maybe not that week, but other weeks I make up for it and I feel better and I'm ready to like hit the ground running on my other goals.
Yeah.
So it takes a little bit of planning. But now that, again, even sleep is a goal of mine on a monthly basis, that planning is worth it, because at the end of the month, I can feel like I checked it off and I achieved it.
That makes sense. And I think this is a perfect segue into this idea of what you said about prioritization. Because now that you've made sleep sort of an achievement, something that you're achieving towards, other things in your life can potentially get shifted. So from a prioritization standpoint, was that initial part of moving things around and maybe deprioritizing things difficult for you? Because, when you live a life where you are going out, you are doing things like that, it can be a habit or almost like you're used to it, or FOMO sometimes kicks in. Like, how hard was that initial process of like deprioritizing certain things?
Yeah, it's hard, and it still is hard for me, especially on the social aspect. So sort of my like natural state is to actually deprioritize social life and prioritize all my other goals instead. Again, because that's how I sort of grew up, right? But there are times where I'm like, no, I want to prioritize my social life. I want to like really invest in my friendships or my relationships or whatever it might be, and those other things get deprioritized. So it's hard for me to say no to goals in the name of investing in relationships, frankly, which I feel like is the opposite for most people. Most people, will prioritize the friendships and whatever else, and their goals will take a hit. I'm the opposite. And it's been particularly difficult to say, no, I'm okay with working out one time less and not meeting that goal, because I really want to go hang out with my best friend, or I really want to go see my mom, or whatever it might be. I think in years prior, I would have deprioritized social life to the point where, friendships were lost because I was not as good at maintaining them.
Yeah.
And now I'm trying to become better at that. And I think realistically, like, most of the people in my life get it because they get this is who I am, right? They get that, like, this is how I like to live my life. And they'll find ways to sort of be part of that with me, which is really sweet. And I love the people who do that so much, because if I'm going to the gym and my friend hasn't seen me in a while, they'll sort of be like, cool, I'm coming to the gym with you.
Yeah.
Right? And it's nice, especially with dance, because a lot of my friendships are made through dance. Going to a dance class or something like that is part of my social life as well.
Right.
So it's helped me find the right people, but it's definitely been really, really hard to prioritize specifically social interactions against all the goals and all the things I want to achieve.
That's a really interesting perspective, because like you said, I don't know if most people that I've talked to in my personal life have just operated that way.
Yeah.
So it's almost, now I'm having to re-rack my brain how I asked this question, but when you're almost scaling back up relationships back in your life because you were sort of prioritizing goals, et cetera, and you scale it back up, what happens when you feel like you're maybe spread too thin at that point? Because I imagine there's some point you get where it's like you're already managing so much, and relationships are a huge thing to manage. When you hit that point of being spread too thin, like, relationships involve people, right? So it's tough to have a conversation with someone sometimes, maybe, or be like, hey, like, I need to scale back, et cetera. Like, how do you navigate that part of it if you feel comfortable talking about it?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think and I'll expand on this a little bit. It's ruthless prioritization. It is to the point of, like, as if you are at work and you have, $10,000 to spend on a thing at work and you don't have a penny more. Where would you spend that money, right? If you're thinking from a work perspective, I do that same thing in my personal life. So if I'm trying to scale up relationships and I'm spread too thin against, like, all the goals I'm trying to achieve and maintaining relationships, I've got to take a hard look, and I do this every now and then, take a step back and say, where am I spending my time? Again, that calendar helps, right? And retaining that source of truth helps. And where does that need to change? Now, if where it needs to change is the amount of time I'm spending with people and the personal relationships, that is the harder conversation to have, right? Because most of the time when it's just my goals and stuff like that, it's just me who's accountable for that.
Yeah, like
it's
the gym's
really
not the gym's feelings aren't going to get hurt if you don't show up,
exactly,
right?
Exactly. So when it is other people, instead of my boss at like 3 jobs ago taught me this. I try to say no. I try not to say no. I try to say not yet. Right? Because the answer is not, I don't want to hang out with you. Or, no, I don't want to, like, go on this vacation. Or, I don't want to come home and see you, mom and dad, right? That's not the message. That's not what I'm trying to do. Yeah. What I'm trying to say is, like, in this moment, my priorities are different, and here's why, right? And so I think framing it mentally as it's not no, it's not yet, helps the other person sort of understand, like, here's what's going on in their life, and that's why today is not possible, or this week is not possible, but at some point it is. That's helpful. And I think the other thing that's helpful is sort of saying, like, okay, what are the trade-offs I can make to still invest in this relationship, but maybe I don't have the time to give physically, right? Can I FaceTime them while I'm getting ready for something else? Yeah. Or can I, you know, if for example, I've gone out, like, eating and drinking a lot, and I really need to go back to prioritizing my gym goals and my health goals, a lot of times what I'll do is I want to hang out with you, but you come over and I'll cook you a meal.
Oh, nice.
Right? Yeah. And I try to find creative ways to say, how can I sustain these things without giving up my goals? Sometimes that's not possible, but a lot of times it is if you just kind of take a step back and think about it and get a little bit creative.
That makes sense. When you have that sort of intentionality going, does it make you understand things in your life, or maybe it could even be people in your life that maybe, like, you know what, these are actually not intentional things that I even need to prioritize? Like, has that process in your head actually helped eliminate things where it's like, you know what, I actually realize, like, because I'm being intentional about this relationship, like, it doesn't need to exist in my life because it doesn't fulfill me in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, wow, yeah, this happens actually, like, on a daily basis for me. Especially when I'm really stressed out and I feel like I have too much to do and not enough hours in the day, I think really hard about, like, okay, where do I even start, right? Everyone sort of has this feeling, it's like, I don't know where to start. Yeah. And to me, the best place to start that I've learned is start with the intention, right? What exactly are you trying to do and why? You know, in some cases, what we do is we throw these big parties, or we, you know, get together with friends, or we go to the gym 7 times a week or whatever. But underlying it, the intention's actually really simple, right? I threw this big party for no reason and invited 150 people. And if that's your thing, great. But sometimes, like, people do that and they feel really crappy after the party's over. And you got to think, like, why, right? And in the cases I've seen that, it's because all people really wanted was to, like, feel included, right? All they really ever wanted was to just, like, feel like they had a group of people around them that could celebrate their achievements or their birthday or whatever it is, right? Yeah. And I think, like, when stuff gets hard, in most cases, myself and I think most people sort of overcompensate. We do too much to make up for it. We take 7 steps when we really only need to take 1, right? And it's actually something I've been thinking about. I'm turning 30 in a few months, which is freaking me out. But that's a different topic. And, you know, as you're approaching 30, everyone always asks, like, what are you going to do for your 30th birthday? It's a big birthday. You can do something big. And for the first time in my life, you know, I've always wanted to throw the big birthday party. And for the first time in my life, I'm sort of like, nah, I kind of just want to be around the people I care about. Yep. You know, it's 1, not that big of a deal, and 2, even if it was a big deal, even if it does represent, you know, a brand new chapter in my life, that chapter for me is really about being surrounded by people I love and having really fulfilling relationships. Yeah. And so if that means that I go to a dinner with 3 people, great. Yeah. Right? So yes, I think intentionality is so important. And I think more often than not, I mean, here's the thing, right? Most people are different from the next person. So you and I are not going to communicate the same way. We're not going to enjoy all of the same things. But at the end of the day, if I understand what your intention is and what you're going for, I'm going to have so much respect for you, right? Even if on the street you come across like an asshole, right? Which you don't.
Thanks.
But like even if someone comes across like an asshole, or like they're like so aggressive, or so they're so this or that, right? And we get so quick to like judge people, and I do this too. If you take a step back and you're like, what are they trying to do here? What's the point? Why are they acting like that, right? most times you can pretty quickly come to an answer and say, like, they just want to feel loved.
Yeah.
Or they just, they have so much going on. They just want to, like, be able to get something done and move on with their life and their day. Or if it's a mom or something like that, or someone who has a lot going on in their day, it's sort of just like they want to be able to accomplish this thing so that they can go on to something that's more important for them. And that's why they're feeling rushed and aggressive or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So anyway, to bring that back to like your initial point, yeah, I think at the end of the day, anytime stuff gets overwhelming, anytime stuff feels like it's too much, or I don't know where to prioritize, or how do I make, my relationships, the people in my life feel good, even though I'm off doing all these other things, I go back to the intention. What am I trying to get out of this, and how do I communicate that in the simplest way? A mistake I've made in the past a lot more, and frankly still today sometimes make, is the lifestyle that I live around time management, like, yes, is impressive, right? And it's sort of like, everyone sees my day and they're like, oh my God, how do you do so much? I want to be able to do that. And I love being like inspiring in that way. Frankly, that does motivate me.
Sure.
But it also comes with a downside. And that downside is most people don't live that way. And so most people are not going to get you. At the end of the day, everyone wants to be able to do all these things. But once they actually get to the point where they are doing all those things, they alienate a lot of people. And I've alienated a lot of people in my life. Some that I'm like, okay, good riddance, because that's life. But some I actually really regret, because I think there have been situations where I've prioritized my personal time management, my goals, even my relationships, to the point where I haven't seen where the other person is coming from. It goes back to the intention thing we were talking about, where I was so clear on my intention that I didn't see what their intention was. And so I think, like, the time management stuff is so valuable and has gotten me so far in life and will continue to do so. Yeah. But it comes with a grain of salt of, like, it might put a strain on relationships, and everyone's going to have a sort of different tolerance for how much that they're willing to put a strain against, right? I think I have a pretty high tolerance, which I don't know if I'm proud of or not, but because it's just such a big, important part of my life. Right. But everyone sort of needs to figure out that tolerance for themselves and where they are, and what they're willing to sort of let go if they choose to live this kind of life, essentially.
And I also wanted to know, like, has there been anything outside of maybe professionally, books that you've read, etc., from just people in general and the way that they're living their lives, that you'd be like, wow, like, that's actually really cool, like, let me try that, even if it's something that hasn't sustained and you still do it now, but something that you're like, oh, this idea, maybe I should give that a shot, with time prioritization or really anything?
Yeah. I actually take this from my parents. So as I mentioned, my parents work, like, insane hours. Right. I don't, as busy as I am, even I don't understand how they've done this for so long, But one thing my dad always prioritizes is, like, breaking bread with people, right? Sharing a meal with people. And it sort of goes to the point where I say to my friends, come over and I'll cook a meal for you. To him, like, the most intimate thing you can do with someone, and the thing that sort of communicates, I love you and I'm here for you, is a meal together. It is, when you, like, it's so funny because you think about it and you go out to eat with, like, everyone you know, right? When you think about it, it's sort of like, I'm inviting you into something that I do on a day-to-day basis. I'm letting you see, like, what I like, what I don't like, especially if you're cooking for someone or someone's cooking for you. That is an act of love and kindness, right? And so for him, it's always been, like, when everything else fails, when I can't do anything else, prioritize the meal with the person. Don't prioritize anything else. Don't even, like, go to their vacation. Don't say no to the vacation. Say no to, like, even in some cases, he's, like, hasn't showed up to people's weddings, right? Because he couldn't, like, figure it out financially in early days of coming to the U.S., right? But he's always prioritized the meal with the person. And even when our family gets together, the biggest point of contention when we're planning a family party is the food, right? You think about, like, Indian families especially. You're like, the food is such a big deal. But you think about why. And it's because to our culture specifically, and I think in a lot of cultures, food and meals represent family, they represent community, they represent culture, they represent time together, and especially, like I said, if you're cooking, they represent, like, love and kindness, and so much can be gained with just a meal with someone. And so, yeah, I think when the going gets tough, I think about my dad and how he always over-orders food. But but specifically how he's always like, let's have a meal together.
So creativity is an interesting one because in my experience, and I'd love to hear your take on this, it's tough to put creativity on a timeline sometimes where it's like you're working on a project or an idea, etc. You don't know how long it's going to take. You don't know when inspiration is going to strike. You don't know when inspiration is going to fall and you have to find it again. So like that's a lot to manage. But at the same time, if you're working in a field where you're putting on dance classes, you have a video shoot that you have to do, etc. You do put a deadline. There are ways where maybe deadlines can help actually focus your creativity and like actually push it in. But I would just love to pick your brain on like the time prioritization piece in relation to creativity. Like how do you manage being creative but also knowing like I have output that I want to get out there, I want to push out projects, dance classes, etc. How do you navigate all that?
Yes. Okay. So I think it's abundantly clear at this point in our conversation that I'm really good at the timelines and the deadlines piece of it.
Yeah.
So my natural state, which I think is the opposite natural state compared to other creatives, is put a deadline on it. It's not, take as much time as you need to be creative. It is put a deadline on it. And I often have to convince myself to step back from that. So I'll put that in context, right? I think most creatives are like, I want to put together, for example, in my case, a really powerful piece that's sort of a dance piece, but also a video production and tells a story, right? And most people will say, I'll do that when it feels right, or when I find the right song, or when I find the right location, right? And most creators, I think, operate in that way. And honestly, I'm a little bit jealous of that, their ability to do that, because I'm the complete opposite. I wish I could let go to that degree. But for me, I work better the opposite way. I say, I know generally, like logistically, how long this stuff is going to take, right? I know rehearsals will take up a piece of it, choreography will take up a piece of it. Yeah. So let me understand all the logistical pieces and add in some buffer time to give myself the room to be creative within reason. Yeah. And work backwards from a date that I choose according to that. Gotcha. So I might say, okay, I want to shoot this piece in a month and a half. And I know that between rehearsals and choreography and whatever else, I only really need like 3 to 4 weeks. But I'm going to set the date for a month and a half from now to give myself a time-boxed version, basically, of like, let the creative juices flow, essentially. For me, that's really helpful because, like I said, I work really well with deadlines. And so having a deadline to work toward allows me to actually make progress. But it still gives me the time to say, if I want to change something, or if the story's not coming across, or if I want some extra feedback from people, I have the time to do that. The downside of that is sometimes I look back at, my work and I say, oh, I wish I thought of this while I was in that process, or wish I did something differently. And if I had just talked to that one extra person, or thought about this a different way, or did some extra research or whatever, I could have gotten there. But I think the reality is, like, no matter how long you take to do something, that's always going to exist. You're always going to wish that something was different or something extra had been tacked on. Yeah. So yeah, I think working backwards from deadlines, even in a creative field, works really well for me. And I actually think that's like my superpower in the creative field. I think, to your point, a lot of creatives don't do that. And they sort of lack the business sense or the project management sense. Right. And I think my superpower in this industry is I have that. I have the business side of it. And so especially when you're working with like brands and clients and the more, professional side of this industry, that's like a really, really big value proposition for them, because most creatives don't have that. And so I try to balance the two to not burn myself out, but also sort of act on that value proposition of like, I am the business facing dancer. If that makes sense.
That does make sense. Yeah. And like, I don't even know if this point even makes sense to bring up, but you did take a little bit of a break from dance. You were building your dance company currently, so you were obviously prioritizing time on that. But was that a sort of a creative decision where it's like, I need to take some time to train, take some time off, and like now I can go back to it in January? Or like, what went into that? Did that factor into it with the creativity at all? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So I mentioned I'm a little bit jealous of the people who can kind of just like let go and not put timelines on things. Yeah. I found myself at the point a few months ago where I was too focused on the numbers and not enough on the creativity. I was too focused on like, how many dance classes can I teach? How many people are coming to these classes? How much money am I making off of them? Right. What song am I choosing that's going to attract the most people in the dance class, right? And all that is important. It's very, very important to sustain a career in dance. But to some degree, and if you do it too much, you lose the whole point. Yeah. Right? The point is to educate people on dance and make them feel good and create an environment where like people can come into that studio, both learn something new and feel challenged, but also feel like heard and accepted and creative, right? And walk out feeling refreshed, right? That's my goal as a teacher when I'm teaching dance classes. And I lost the plot. Like, I was so focused on the numbers that it felt right to just take a full stop break. Taking a couple steps back didn't feel right to me. I was also burnt out. I was so focused on the numbers that I was just doing too much.
Yeah.
And like I said earlier, I have other goals, right? My health and nutrition were falling through. My sleep was falling through. My relationships were falling through. And I said, okay, like, it's time to prioritize some of those other things. What's got to give? And in this case, teaching dance was what had to give. And I'm honestly, like, really proud of that decision because, one, it's not like me to make a decision like that. I would usually just do more, not less.
Right.
But two, I came out of it feeling really refreshed. Like, I feel so energized now. I'm so excited to launch my dance company. I have so many ideas around it. And I'm, like, itching to teach a dance class again.
Right.
I, like, cannot wait to be back in that environment. And that's the goal. Sometimes it's the same idea as, like, paid time off in a corporate job, right? Like, it exists for a reason. It's because if you don't take it, like, you're not actually going to be very good at your job long term.
Yeah.
And so in a more creative, self-led field, like, you've got to create those opportunities for yourself too.
I was curious if you've ever looked at your life planned ahead, and not just like a year or two, but like decades from now, where like, eventually we're all going to get way, way, way older. And like, do you think some of the sustained time, like prioritization, how much you're doing is still going to be a sustained thing over the course of decades? Or do you think at a certain point you're like, after I've achieved the things that I want to achieve, I don't know how long your goals and your vision go, but I do want to scale back and maybe take it easy and prioritize other things?
Yeah. I think in like the midterm, which the midterm to me is like 10-ish years, right?
Okay, yeah.
10, 15 years. In the midterm, that level of detail around prioritization will stay.
Okay.
But the items within it will change, right? Right now, like, going out with friends is a priority. But, 10 years from now, it might be raising a family. Right? So the items within it might change, but the fundamentals of scheduling my life in a very deliberate way, and sort of thriving under pressure when I have a lot to do, I don't think will change. I think, like I said, like, I grew up like this ever since I was like 5-6 years old. Like, if it's stuck for this long, it's gonna stick for a while.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, yeah, I do think at some point I do want to scale back, and that I think is less motivated by like, I'm doing all of this now so that I can retire in peace or whatever.
Right.
It's actually more motivated by seeing my parents not scale back, right? And seeing my parents, who are now in their 60s and 70s, still be workaholics and still have a hard time, closing their store for a day to go to like a family event. It like hurts them to do so.
Right.
They're just like, they just like love to work so much, which I make fun of them for. But then I look at myself and I'm the
like,
same way, and it's like seeing my future right in front of me.
Right.
It's sort of like, this is what my life is going to be like. And, I love them. I love them so much. But
Yeah.
they, I think, have taught me, obviously, a million great things. They've also taught me what I don't want when I'm their age. And that's something I don't want. I see them not spending as much time with their grandkids, my brother's kids, as they would like to. I see them, frankly, like, not having as many friendships as I think they would like to. And I see, like, everything else that's taken a toll as a result of having this achievement mindset far long after they've had to. Essentially, right? It started as like I need to make it in the U.S., American dream type mindset. They no longer really need that, but it's just so ingrained in them that they just don't know how to stop.
Right.
So I am pretty deliberate about, reminding myself that like, this is the life I live now, not because I have to, but because I like to, and I can choose, and that's a privilege, right? To be clear.
Yeah.
But I have to remind myself that like, you can choose to not. At some point, right? That's not gonna be today. That probably won't be 10 years from now. But at some point, you can choose to say, no, don't want to live this kind of life anymore because other stuff is more important. And the likely case is that other stuff is going to be my family and seeing the world and slowing down in old age because, like, again, I want to, not because I have to.
That makes sense. And the last question that I love to ask everybody, because the podcast is called Improving Humans, is there a quote, a concept, or even idea that's helped you improve as a person? Doesn't have to be related to time management or prioritization, but just really in general that's maybe helped you improve. Yeah.
So I saw this. I've seen it in different ways in a bunch of different places, but I saw it said this concisely, like while I was scrolling through Instagram one day. It's basically, if you're not changing it, you're choosing it. I love that because I think so many people get caught up in a rut of complaining about certain things being a certain way. And it's sort of like, if you have the power to change it, change it. And if you don't, part of not change, if you're not changing it, you're choosing it. But part of that is like, you can't change everything. And so if you can't change it, another way to say that is like, accept it and learn to work around it, right? Choosing it can also just mean accepting it. And so this is a funny example, but like, one thing I can't change, and you bet I've tried, one thing I can't change is that my parents are workaholics. They're not, as much as they may theoretically want to retire and spend more time with family and do whatever, and as much as I may see them aging and I want them to slow down and I want to be able to provide for them, I can't change that. I've tried, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm sort of at the point in my life where I'm like, okay, how can I invest in my relationship with my family, with my parents specifically, and how can I make that a priority for me to be more around for my parents as they're aging, while accepting that they're not going to retire, right? It's a hard problem to solve.
Yeah.
But once you understand what, like, this is something you can't change, and you just got to, like, accept it or quote unquote choose it, then you can, like, do something about it. But until you get to that point, you can't really do something about it. Another example is the classic, like, I want to lose weight, I want to, invest in my career or whatever. Those are things you can control. And so, again, if you're not changing it, you're choosing it. So, again, it goes back to, like, ruthless prioritization and living your life in a way that, what are you choosing or what are you changing?